Nigeria's presidential legacies since independence in 1960 reflect a complex history of civilian and military rule, marked by efforts to unify a diverse nation, economic challenges, political instability, and varying degrees of governance success, from Tafawa Balewa, Aguiyi Ironsi, Yakubu Gowon, Murtala Muhammed, Olusegun Obasanjo, Shehu Shagari, Muhammadu Buhari, Ibrahim Babangida, Sani Abacha, Ernest Shoneko, Umar Yar'Adua, Goodluck Jonathan, and Bola Tinubu. What legacies can be ascribed to each according to their time and influence on governance and Nigerian people? This is the Eastern Eye. I'm Alex Obodo. You're welcome to the Eastern Eye, a program that X-rays the political, social, and economic developments around us. Tonight, I'm joined by Comrade Fidelis Edeh. He is a former deputy president of the Nigeria Labour Congress, NLC. Ezudonoboka, thank you so much for joining me tonight on the Eastern Eye.
Thank you, Alex, for having me.
So, clearly, when we talk about legacies of a president, what are we referring to really? Because it looks like there's been some misconception as to what qualifies to be part of someone's legacy, whether in or out of government.
Well, Alex, being the first in the series of programs, particularly after the death of our former president, former President Buhari, I think it will just be within our common humanity for me to once more, being the first time I'm appearing on this program after the death, not just condole the family, but to say that we must learn in terms of the demise of any human person, particularly those who have had the privilege of holding positions of national importance, to reflect and share with their family and relatives. So I want to use this medium also to express my condolence to the family, affiliates, and those who sincerely believed that Buhari did his best. No human is perfect, but I think we all agree he was a man of integrity. We all agree he was a stallion soldier, but like most will say, the Nigerian environment is not one that easily people can conquer. May his soul rest in peace.
Amen. Now,
coming to the question you've just raised, it's a difficult one because I'm not going to deal with perception. And if you look at the history of the Nigerian nation building, for me, the question will be, is it actually possible to begin to ascribe legacy to a particular regime, now the issue is presidential presidents that have ruled? I ask this question, given the trajectory of our national development, even our inability to have built cohesion. If you look at 1914 to 60, that was about 46 years or thereabouts, out of which the only time Nigeria tried to assert themselves from 53, when we had the regional government, was just 7 years before independence. Then we had independence. By 63, Nigeria became a republic under circumstances that were not just ordinary. It's not as if Nigerians met and say, let's have a republic. We all know the story of the crisis in the West and the reversal of the decision of the Supreme Court by the Privy Council and the federal government under Tafawa Balewa saying no, that Nigeria is independent and the Supreme Court ought to be final, which was essentially what brought about the Republic. Because if you look at the 60 Constitution and that of 63, the only major reform you will see there is the change of Governor General to President, which was occupied by our great Sikh. If you now look at what happened from 67, first starting from the first military coup by Nzogu and his team, then same year, I think by July, the second military coup. Most people don't always look at that the way Gowon emerged at a coup, but it was. And subsequently, if you now look at the totality of the military incursion up to date, it will seem as if the military had about 30 years. And if you add what we had up to when Buhari left, the civilian government had about 33. But one thing that is striking, why for me, there could be bookmakers, there could be researchers that will begin to delineate as what will constitute legacy. But the point is that if you look at what brought about the second military coup, apart from the fact that a certain section of the country felt that the then Governor General, head of state Ironsi, precisely didn't quite handle the coup the way it would have been. That is, the mutineers, those who had executed the coup, and given the fact that there was the cliche or this ascribing the coup as Igbo coup, and that Decree 34 that brought about the unification. Mind you, as at that 67, we had 4 regional government with their constitution. We had 3 before the Republic. Then by the time the Midwest emerged out of the Placebet, it was 4. Each had its own constitution. But Decree 34, which Ironsi decreed, now unified the entire country. But when the second coup came, which was kicking against that particular unification, it is surprising that we have lived by it almost how many years after. The subsequent military coups tried to even double on that. They tried to centralize government. In fact, Gowon, it started with Gowon when he now created states out of the 4 regions and 2 states out of the East Central state, just as a measure to counter the secession bid of East Central states on Eastern region. So when you now look at the fluid, given particularly the reason or the aims of the first military coup, which was in Nzogu's coup, about that the coup was about trying to restore discipline, trying to terminate corruption, that they were after corrupt leaders. And you look at the subsequent military coups, you will discover that the story remained the same. The same story. Today, we still are faced with challenges of corruption, challenges of maladministration. In fact, Nigeria has become more dysfunctional than what we used to have. But if you now look at the advent of the presidential system starting from Shagari, you will discover that at every given time, there's always this move to stabilize. But the incursion of the military will usually set us back. And when they will exit, they will also start a process that will see as if we are trying to adopt a new constitution. So under this situation, how do we now begin to track legacy? Because what I know of legacy is what have come to endure, what is acceptable, what is legitimate, a value which in totality the people embrace. Yes, we still have one Nigeria, but the level of divisiveness, the level of tribalism, the level of conflict, the fact that we don't have strong institutions, you know, what kind of legacy are we now supposed to begin to track? If you look at particularly the Buhari's regime, you know, when they came in and upstaged Gowon, yes, no, they upstaged Shagari. You will also see that the gain we were supposed to have made under the democratic dispensation if we had had a successful transition, that if Alex Ekwueme had taken over, one thing that would have been clear, the level of conflict, the level for call for restructure, the level of marginalization, particularly in the Southeast, arising from after effect of the Civil War, wouldn't have been there. And if you also look at the Second Republic, despite the fact that we had had the Civil War, you can see the gain that was made, particularly given the alliance that came between MPN and MPP. Is it not surprising that under same governments, despite the fact that Alex Ekwueme was vice president, the Igbos were still able, through the alliance of MPP and MPN, to secure the House of Representatives? That is compromise. That is give and take. That is inclusion. So I don't want to begin to count legacies in terms of whether we have National Youth Service Corps program, or whether you had PTF, Petroleum Trust Fund program, or whether we had the creation of states. When people talk about creation of states, we must also return to Wellington Commission's report when there were agitations for creation of state. And that report, the recommendation said, no, that Nigeria cannot continue to talk about state creation, because the more states you create, the more minorities that will emerge with agitation in the new states that will emerge. So when people ascribe state creation as a point of decentralization, or getting government nearer to people, or giving that people sense of belonging, we know it is not so from what has happened. In fact, ours is a democracy that is a bit conflicted. If you use our American system, you just talked about that part of this review is the presidential system. Nigeria remains the only presidential system that has 3 tiers of government. Whether you are looking at the US, Canada, Brazil, Australia, India, it's usually 2-tier. And that is why you have the kind of confusion we have. You have a 3rd tier, which is the local government, but you discover that it is not operational. Even recently, when the president tried to throw executive act, and we have even a Supreme Court decision, you now still discover it's not working. So the point I'm making is that we could pick certain legacies, but these legacies are not something that call for celebration, because the trajectory we need to move in order to consolidate and begin now to ascribe legacies to regimes in terms of continuity, if we had had a successful democratic practice, are not in existence.
Okay, Comrade, just let me just put it this way. In looking at these legacies, let me pick out 2 regimes and draw your attention to them. And that is Muhammadu Buhari's first coming as a military leader in when he took over, of course, from Shagari in 1983. And of course, Sani Abacha's reign when he took over from Ernest Shoneko. So let's take a look at these 2 regimes and maybe put it in perspective. Would you say that maybe that's the strongest time that the military, in terms of what we had under military dictatorship, those were the times Nigerians said, wow, this is just too much? I mean, because that's possibly what we're looking at in terms of either the legacy of the military or the legacy of the civilian rule. Would you say that we had the Nigerians were squeezed more in these 2 regimes in the military era?
Well, Alex, you see, in trying to talk about, I'm not a regular analyst. It's not like you have regular citizens that flow with the tide. When you say Nigerians, and assuming we are doing a diagnosis, who are the Nigerians and how did they come about? I've just told you, as at 1967. In fact, by 1953, before the regional government, did we have Nigerians? Yes, we had Nigerians in 1942 by a simple act of amalgamated, but did we truly have Nigerians in the sense we want to portray it now, or in the sense that is defined by the constitution we presently operate? No, we had people who belong to the regions. And that purpose of having Nigeria was aborted in 67. I just told you that we had four constitutions as at the time of independence. You had regional constitutions, then you have a federal constitution. So Nigeria was still in the march of trying to weld themselves together so that they can begin to be a nation. They can say we are Nigerians. And that is why if you look back today, you will discover that we are still so divided along ethnic, religious, and tribal lines. So when you talk about Nigerians being squeezed, it is not that Nigerians were being squeezed. The thing is that Nigerians were being pushed into something they were not familiar with. I just told you that the Nzoku coup, one of the things it brought about was Decree 34 by Ironsi, which was the unification decree. But when the second coup occurred, and given that the North has always kicked again, did you understand that part of why the independence could not come in 57 was the North was not ready to go for independence. They've always said they will not be part of this Nigeria that is being designed. So, except there is another definition we want to give, because I want us at this stage of our development to begin to track that road we took that made it impossible for Nigerians to be where they ought to be. So when you now say Nigerians are being squeezed, under the regime you identified Buhari, and yes, Buhari and the Diabo tried, to be excessive in their use of military degree. I can easily recall Decree 2 and Decree 4. Decree 2, I think, was the one that gave the Chief of Supreme Military Council the powers to detain any citizen within 6 months without anybody asking questions. Once they consider that person as a security risk, then Decree 4 targeted the press in terms of publication. Under them, a lot of social forces, student union, Nigerian Medical Association, Nigerian Labour Congress, they were all under one prescription or the other. Strikes were forbidden and all that. So if it's that aspect, we were talking about squeezing. And you also knew that a lot of politicians were tried under military tribunals and handed the kind of jail terms that were laughable. Jail terms that will outlive even those who have been jailed. But when Murtala took over, when Murtala and his team came, they tried to liberalize, but they still did not annul some of those decrees. There was nothing they did to want to return to constitutional democracy. It was the same with IBB. IBB also tried to play the same game, but also tried to wield power. And in fact, he became Maradona by the way he tried to play with Nigerians. So the point I am making is that there was no regime you can delineate and say, yes, that this was what they achieved in terms of, in fact, how do you talk about even civil rights or human rights under a military rule? And I told you that whatever gain we ought to have made was terminated in 67. Then the next one we wanted to make under Shehu Shagari, when we still had the multi-party system, was still terminated. So in terms of legacy, if legacy is obnoxious policies, it has always been with us. It started from a military regime. In fact, part of the challenge of the First Republic, which we saw, was also a contention where you had power domiciled with the Prime Minister, with the Governor General being ceremonial. These were all what brought about the friction. But even at that point, the regions were working, agriculture was booming, so people didn't quite have the kind of central command or control. But states were moving at their pace. When you talk about, let's use universities, for instance, as an index of development. You look at the first generation universities that we are, you discover that we are all built through agricultural products and income. But subsequently, the challenge we had, if you will allow me this space, was not even just peculiar Nigerian challenge, but it was something Nigeria couldn't manage. And that was the Arab-Israeli war. That is Israel and Syria, the war which Egypt and Syria were almost trying to overrun Israel. Then America intervened, that gave Israel upper hand. Then in trying now to react, the Arab countries now brought about what was called oil shock. That oil shock was what spurred the price of crude oil from $3 to $12. That was how the Nigerian challenge in excess revenue generation now came in, which Gowon could not manage. And that was what brought about profligacy, corruption. In fact, it killed agriculture because we now entered the era of importation. And if you look at the trajectory of how Nigeria became a dumping ground, became a consumption country, moving away from agriculture, for which we were already making inroads, you can also count that as a legacy under the military, but it's a very sad and an ironic one indeed.
We'll take a break at this point. When we return, we'll continue our conversation with Comrade Fidelis Edeh. Stay with us. You're welcome back to the Eastern Eye here on AFIA TV, a program that X-rays the political, social, and economic developments around us. My name is Alex Obodo. My guest is still Comrade Fidelis Edeh, former Deputy President of the NLC. So, Comrade, let's take a look at how the military rule has rubbed off on the country. So, because there are remnants of that we see when civilian governments react. It looks like we've seen that before. Is this something you've also seen, the way they react, especially to criticism, to press that's not favorable to them? The way they react, is it something similar you've seen, especially during the military times?
Well, Alex, I thank you for this question because I think it's tried to capture the frame of reference I've tried to lay down. I remember the late Professor Ben Nwabeze saying that the only legitimate constitution we had as a country is the 1960 Constitution. And I agree with him. You see, the idea of democracy is based on civil liberty. That is the critical pillar. And civil liberty thrives under the rule of law. If you also look at the 1999 Constitution, you can see section 4, which is the fundamental rights. But you see, for this section to be operative, there must be an enabling environment dictated by two critical pillars. If you look at section chapter 4, of the Constitution, that dealt on fundamental right. Section 16, which dealt with economic objective, that tried to say that the resources, our commonwealth, should not be vested in the hands of few. But we're all aware that this is not true. If you also look at the Constitution, particularly the legislature, you will now ask yourself, what is the role, particularly if you now want to begin to talk about the state, when you have a section of the Constitution that also empowers the National Assembly to take over a state assembly if they consider it fit. You also have another section, I think 162, that has to do on distribution. You centralize revenue, and every month people now go to distribute. These are fundamental to trying to ensure that democracy thrives. So when you are saying whether it rubs off, I am saying that that is what we live. Ours is not yet in practice. I just talked about one aspect, a pillar of democracy, which is civil liberty. The other critical one is political democracy, that there will be periodic election. And periodic election is not just the counting of votes. It means that vote ought to be waived, so that when people are voting, they are not voting you because you are from their tribe. They are voting you based on the fact that the Constitution of Nigeria in section 225 has prescribed that no party will be registered except it has manifesto. And that manifesto will drive from chapter 2, which is the directive principle. So that when people are voting, they will be voting just because either that you've said you will provide. We saw a little bit of that in the Second Republic in terms of the parties. You know, when you talk about MPN, you know what they represent. You talk about Action Group, you talk about MPN. But a situation you still have is, yes, we have a constitution, but the states are like appendix to the federal. And the state assembly, the judiciary that ought to be tiers, arms of government that will checkmate the executive, are tied to the executive, which in effect tied to the federal government. How are we now saying whether the states are behaving? They are just a product, they are a chip of the block of a constitution that has not given the citizens right. If indeed we are citizens, I am particular about the words I use, because if we talk about citizens, the definition of a citizen, you will discover that Nigerians are more or less subjects. And that was why when I started, I talked about legacy, because our idea of legacy include or should mean things for which people are celebrating, things that are enduring, things where we look back, we will say, even the National Youth Service Corps, people used to talk about, assuming we had functional democracy, you don't need to begin to get people to move from their region in order to have a feel of the other one. Even the challenge of the federal character you find in the Constitution, we don't need to have it in the 1960 Constitution. It was not there because, like I have pointed out, regions were developing at their pace. Regions were, in fact, the North was so comfortable with their agricultural production that they believed they didn't even need to be part of Nigeria. The East was rated as one of the most thriving economies. In fact, within the circle of Asian countries, Singapore and what, Nigeria was already a star that was emerging. You know, when agriculture accounted for 65% of our GDP and 75% of export. So for you to talk about human rights, for you to talk about citizen participation, there must be that economic empowerment. And the economic empowerment is not patronage. It's not what you donate to the people. It is the people trying to thrive. If you look at 1929, the Aba Women Riot, it was about taxation. It was the people saying, no, you can't tax us this much. It was people expressing themselves. So when you have conquered the people, that they are no longer economic agents, they are not productive, they self-esteem, they are not part of the process that decide what affects them, then what rights have you allowed them? That is where it is. And that's why our governors are more or less procurement officers. In fact, there is nothing you can do in a state if you don't have access to the governor or government house. Do you still hear about ministries? Is there any state you can go to now and secure a legitimate business with a ministry and it is sealed at that point? So when people talk about building institution, you don't build institution under a patronage system where you have pillars or poles that distribute common wealth. based on their own discretion, not based on laws that should operate in order to achieve equity and justice.
So, I mean, typically what I see is that there are many things that Nigerians may not have liked that they've seen over the years. But let's talk about the civil war that you referenced. Because before the war, you referenced that the Eastern Nigeria was one of the fastest growing economies. Is it safe to say that the war constitutes a black spot on whatever legacy Nigeria had?
You see, like I had pointed out, the war was what has brought us to where we are, not in terms of the civil war per se, but the combination of contradictions that led to the civil war. First, I think the first military coup, which unfortunately the Igbos have to carry the tag, even when it was very obvious that it was never planned by the Igbo. Because if you look at the position in the Igbo we are holding as at that time, who on earth would want to shoot himself down when he was on top? If Ironsi was not promoted on a quota basis, Zik did not emerge as governor general. In fact, but for the bad politics, everybody knew that Zik ought to have been the prime minister. In fact, if we had started presidential system from independence, I don't think anybody would have had it before Zik, you know. So the Igbos were already, if you look at the judiciary, you know the Igbo's name, the Mbane Fos. If you look at the Senate, the Woke, it just mentioned. So how could the Igbos have organized a coup to displace themselves in a country they were already emerging as leading light? But he now pleased those who had the second coup to try to baptize the first coup as Igbo coup. And from there, the misfortune of Ndi Igbo has never, gained traction and destabilized what we used to be. But even at that, now, the other aspect of the Civil War, which is tied to military rule, is that the unification brought about by Decree 34, which the North had rejected. I would have, let me tell you, if that decree was annulled or dispensed with immediately after the war, and the regions had returned to their regions as it was before 1967, I tell you that Nigeria would have been far, far better off, because we would have still had a federal government that does not breathe down on the regions. But what happened was, as a result of the Civil War, if you will recall, it was the same day the Eastern Region Consultative Forum that included all the legislative arm. In fact, the Governor General, the President then, who was Zik, was part of that consultation. On the same day, they gave Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu, as he then was, the mandate to succeed, was the day Gowon announced the creation of 12 states, creating 2 out of the Eastern region. That is Cross River and Rivers, now making the East Central State as hinterland in order to halt the East from, one, denying us access to the sea and removing everything you have about oil, the Niger Delta areas. But the question will be, how has this region, how have these states fared? Then the unification, how has it benefited even those who felt they had the power? Today, when you talk about poverty, when you talk about insurgents, when you talk about anarchy in terms of ungoverned space, it is more in the North. This is not, I'm not celebrating it. I'm saying it's part of what the price of the war. So when we talk about the war, you will discover that on a scale, just like when you talk about presidential system, and they tell you that the Nigerian presidential system is the most expensive. Yes, it's the most expensive relative to GDP. Because if you look at the Nigerian GDP, what we are spending in the presidential system, then you look at America, their GDP and their presidential system, you will discover that ours is most expensive. So if you also look at the impact of the unification, you will see how it has even impacted negatively on those it has given false sense of identity. For instance, it is the quota system that has brought about the layback in education in the North. I can tell you under the region, the North was already thriving. And that was why before 1967, people who were not of Nathan extraction will only get jobs in the public service there on contract, because the North was already building manpower. Once they get somebody qualified to take your position, they terminate your contract. So the North was already developing in terms of manpower. But the unification came, and with petrodollar, people now think that money is everything, that they didn't even need that human resource and development. And we see where it has taken us. So the Civil War did not even affect the Southeast to the extent it has affected some regions. But specifically for the Southeast, what has come to me as a contradiction and as a dilemma is that, like I cited, if you look immediately after the war, with even the 20 pounds, the marginalization, how come by 1979, the Southeast had grown traction that under NPP with Zik, yes, Zik contested presidential election. And that's why I continue to revere Zik. He remains a political wizard. He also tried it in the First Republic. Zik will always go, but at the end of the day, he will still secure for Ndi Igbo at the national level, knowing that the Igbos are everywhere, beyond even Nigeria. In fact, the Wellington Commission report acknowledged the Igbos as excellent in trade and services, and we are so dispersed in all the regions and outside Nigeria. So Zik will always take that in consideration in his political calculation. In 79, yes, he lost, but through alliance, NPP was still able to secure plum positions in the ministerial and House of Rep. But today, if you check the role the Ndi Igbo played in PDP, that's what has brought us to where we are. That today we are not even in the second 11 of national politics. So when we talk about the war, the only thing I think the war has done for us is that it now killed that spirit which was engendered by the Igbo Union. That spirit of Onyaga na Nwanne and Onye Ndi Igbo Gburugburu na-eche. So today we have, look at the incident that is taking place now in Ghana. That the Igbos now behave as if they are authority unto themselves without bothering about the consequences of their action on the other Igbo people who are dispersed. Yeah. So the civil war, yes, remain something that had dragged Nigeria back. But it's not the civil war about just Ndi Igbo. So when you talk about marginalization today, let people not keep talking about the Southeast. The real marginalization in Nigeria today, whether you are talking about poverty scale, whether you are talking about insecurity, whether you are talking about low unemployment, whether you are talking out of children out of school, it is not in the Southeast. So that is just the point. The effect of the Civil War came to hurt those who thought that Civil War was an opportunity to marginalize the Ndi Igbo. But the Igbos, knowing they have been counted up and given who we are, we decided to keep working on our own. But today, even as we are trying to be independent, you know, as are trying to be on our own, we still have not been allowed to be. Thanks also to the kind of political leadership we've always produced. I doubt whether they are seriously the Igbos we used to know immediately after.
You made a very, very important point, and that is the kind of consideration Zik gave to whatever political decision he made, knowing that Ndi Igbo are all over the place. Instead of being narrow in his approach, he decided to always go national and really get something from his association, not just for himself, but putting into consideration Ndi Igbo anywhere they find themselves across Nigeria and the world. Do you think that that's the missing link now with the current set of politicians we have in the Southeast.
Yes, Alex, you see, I don't know whether this will sound as if it's patronizing, but I must commend you for what you and AFIA is doing for Southeast. And I believe that our people should be able to cue into it. The mental climate that is dominant is in Igbo land today is anti the Igbo DNA. You see, what has happened is that narrative started under the MPN, but it didn't take root because Zeke was throughout his life an inclusive person. In fact, if you recall, Zeke was even more celebrated outside Igbo land than within what we have. Now, this is what has happened. And that was why I pointed to you about the miscalculation, not as a result, it wasn't a mistake, it was a strategic position for Igbo that we were associated with PDP. But when the betrayal came as a result of zoning, because if you recall, the idea of 6 geopolitical zone was something that came from Ekweme. It came from his midwife in G34. Ordinarily, everybody knew that Ekweme ought to have been. In fact, if we had allowed the civilian North, Ekweme was who they rooted for until the military guys led by Babangida came and released Obasanjo from prison. The other one, as they used to say, is history. But again, Ekweme remained at that national level and was canvassing. If you look at the Constitutional Conference, where this issue of geopolitical zone was canvassed, the idea was the idea of rotation. And I think he achieved it. But as we now missed it with the PDP, when the PDP, despite the fact that it was in their constitution, as a result of what Ekweme brought, that presidency should rotate along the geopolitical zone. And one point I want to make is that people must not confuse federal character and zoning. Federal character is what you have in the constitution. It's for appointments. And it was there because of the North that felt that because of educational advantage of the South, that if you now begin to do federal appointment by merit, that the North will not get it. Then the idea of zoning was the South saying that the North has this population. So if the election was just by population, it will be the North. But Murtala, which is one legacy now, I will point out. Now, in 1975, during the Constitutional Conference, they now engineered this idea of federal political parties and appointments. And that's why we started having national parties. It was no longer regional. So based on that, I would have thought that when the mistake in PDP came, the logic for zoning ought not to have been for South. Because if we were dealing with geopolitical zone, it would have just been that there are 3 zones that have not produced presidents. And these zones are Southeast, North Central, and Northeast. So if that was the campaign and we have built up that momentum, that means even if the president had come from North Central or Northeast, invariably, without negotiation, the vice president ought to have come from Southeast. So what it means is that presently, as vice president, just like Ekweme positioned himself under Shagari, we would have been the one now bidding, because it could have been the zone that have not produced. But when PDP now played their game, which Atiku led, I think the game was now APC and the South now bought into it. And today, Tinubu became the beneficiary. And that is why in the present game that is before us now, we had to sit down and calculate. I don't like talking about individuals, but when people want to talk about this party of ADC, I ask myself, how can it be those who have debarred us our legitimate rights that are the one now leading to see whether they can also play the game again. Without fear, Alex, assuming even what is being said now can play out, which I know it cannot, can we legitimately now say that if an Igbo man is elected for a year to serve out Tinubu's tenure, that is what the Igbos have stood for since after the war? No. For me, if I'm asked, the best game we can play now is to have how to position ourselves so that when the position of the presidency will be going to North, first, we must insist it will go to either North Central or Northeast. That way, we will produce the next vice president. Invariably, by the time it is through, we won't be talking about whether it will come to Southeast, because the Southeast will benefit exactly the kind of gracious consideration the Southwest was given on the matter of June 12th, when Falaye and Obasanjo had to be propelled up, even when AD could not qualify. Obono was pressurized to step down. We must play the Nigerian politics, because politics in Nigeria is still regional, is still tribal, is still religious, but this is the time to build forces with which we will go. Let's not make the mistake we made with Buhari when we lose out and they now begin to reward those who voted. We now begin to talk about marginalization, that the constitution expects equity. Politics in Nigeria, which is zoning, is not enshrined in the constitution. What is enshrined is federal character. We will usually get our share of ministers appointed by the president. But when you now talk about the elective position, that is where I want us to build our next strategy. So, yes, Southeast is in a position now to start bargaining for the next presidency as a legitimate campaign authored and advanced by Ekwueme, and we must continue to remember those great Igbo sons. Ekwueme didn't work for himself, Zik didn't work for himself, but we have so moved back that we have left that trajectory of playing national politics. We can't play by the sideline.
We can't play by the sidelines. And I have to thank you so much, Comrade Fidelis Edeh, for your submissions on the Eastern Eye tonight. We're unfortunately out of time, but I still have a lot of questions to ask you. We'll have time to further this discussion, if not here, maybe on radio. Thank you so much, Comrade Fidelis Edeh, former Deputy President of the Nigeria Labour Congress, NLC. Thank you for your perspectives on the Eastern Eye.
Alex, well done on what you are doing. God bless you.
And you too. And that's the Eastern Eye for tonight. Do join us tomorrow, same time, for another episode of the Eastern Eye. My name is Alex Obodo. Good night.